Yeah.
But yeah, so thank you, Jesse, for coming on. Um, so I know like you had some experience on the hill, so I just kind of want to ask, what was your pathway to working on the hill and even like your trajectory like afterwards and like how that experience was?
Yeah, it's super interesting. So let me just back up and just say I'm a unicorn in the sense that I always knew I wanted to do policy work and political work ever since I was like in middle school. I grew up in the era of Columbine, and so gun violence was always the backdrop of where I lived. I'm from Yonkers, New York. And so when I was in middle school, I actually brokered a conversation between Senator Schumer and our local mayor to talk about gun control and gun violence. And I was bright-eyed, bushy-tailed. I thought, I know policy like the back of my hand. I'm going to DC. I'm going to make change. And so I applied to American University, got in. So I came down to DC and sure enough, interned at a number of think tanks doing policy work. But folks used to always tell me, if you really want to make lasting change, you have to write the laws. And so I actually interned, like you'll hear many, many other people say that they interned on Capitol Hill. I interned for Ed Towns. Ed Towns actually founded CRISP. He was and still is a social worker. And it's interesting. I often think about my time in his office as just like being the right time, the right place, and having a lot of luck. And so the reason why I say that is I started in 3 months in, the scheduler decided she was leaving and moving back to Washington State with her husband. Ed, being a 30-year incumbent member of Congress, comes out of his office and says, Jesse, how would you like to make $37,000 a year being my scheduler? Again, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, just graduated 3 months after out of college. $37,000 seemed like the world. I said, Ed, I'm your guy. And took the job. I had no idea what I was doing. Fast forward 4 or 5 months later, it's wintertime in New York City. Ed and his wife are down in the markets, Christmas shopping. He's trying to buy a sweater or a scarf. And he calls me, he says, Jesse, my credit card just got declined. What is that? I said, Ed, I don't know. I've been leaving the credit card statements on your desk. You should be paying them. He said, no, that's your job. Right. And so he said, when I come back after Christmas break, you've got two options. One, you're going to be out of my office and get a new job. Or two, you'll be in the legislative affairs shop doing policy work and we'll find another scheduler. I said, Ed, I'm going to do policy. So again, within 8 months of graduating, I had gone from being a scheduler to now being kind of a legislative aide, which is a tremendous leap for anybody. Usually that's like a 2-year process, but I kind of fell backwards into it. And I tell that story only to say, like, you have to be prepared for the opportunity when it presents itself, but you also have to have a little bit of luck on your side. So when I was in the ledge shop, I was there for 3 or 4 years. The congressman retired. At that point, then Senator Barack Obama was running for president. He was up in Ohio, and I said, I'm getting on a bus and I'm going to go up to Cleveland, Ohio, and I'm going to campaign. Like, this guy is going to win. So I got up on a bus, shook hands, kissed babies, made a lot of introductions, and found myself with an opportunity to work for Congresswoman Marcia Fudge from Cleveland, Ohio, who would then become the chairwoman of the Congressional Black Caucus. Again, these are both members of the Black Caucus. Black Caucus is significant because they are the largest voting Democratic bloc within Congress, within the Democratic Party. And so they have a lot of clout. And as chairwoman of that caucus, I have some residual clout. And so I worked for her for about 3 or 4 years. And so in totality, I worked on Capitol Hill for 7 years. But, I think that I would not have had the opportunity to get to the position that I was if I wasn't on Capitol Hill. So I often tell people, if you can apply directly and get the job, great, amazing, congratulations. But far more often, you're going to have to take that unpaid internship. I think there's a movement now happening to have those internships paid. I sit on the board for Pay Our Interns, so we're trying to do that. But when I was interning, it was unpaid. And the reason why I say you'll have to take those internship opportunities is because it's easier to network and get the pulse of how offices are recruiting talent when you're in the building, because you're hearing it firsthand rather than being outside and having to hear, through third-hand information. So super long-winded way to answer your question, but that's my story of how I got to Capitol Hill.
Yeah, I think it's like payment for playment, I think is the movement. P for P. I actually just heard that today. We were talking about another session.
I love that.
Yeah. So compensation for your work should be compensated.
Well, I mean, I think that the reason why it's so important is, I mean, August, I don't know your background. I'm just going to assume by your last name you might be Hispanic. Okay, so I mean, we have three Hispanics on this call, right? There are high barriers of access for our people from a financial, from a geographical, and just from a historical perspective. And so if we can just lower one of those barriers through pay, that we're now being just as competitive in the workforce as our white peers. So I think that that's a really important thing that, you know, we cannot ignore.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So I guess with that history on being on the Hill, where are you now? And like, assuming like you left the Hill.
Yeah, definitely left the Hill. So I will say, and August, before you got on, I was kind of joking with Marisa, like, you know, my first boss, Ed, would always say, working on the Hill, it's all praise and no raise, right? And you don't get paid well as a public servant at all, right? It's long hours, it's low pay, it's unpredictable as to whether or not you're going to have a job in 2 years. If you work on the House side, you don't know if you're going to have a job in 6 years if you work on the Senate side. At the state level, it might be a little bit different, but my experience is on the federal. So, you know, after 7 years working for low wages, I thought, let me go work in the private sector. I want to understand how I can translate the language of Congress to the language of business, helping businesses or individuals navigate this bureaucratic mess. Because at the end of the day, policy does impact people on an individual basis. And so I ended up working at a multi-client lobbying firm representing clients like Intel, Patagonia, Microsoft, Verizon, institutions, nonprofits. And that was fun. That was exciting. I did that for 5 or 6 years. And, you know, from that perspective, you know, you really have to, you know, educate your clients or educate, you know, different companies, how to interpret laws, whether laws are actually real or harmful, how to communicate with lawmakers, how to introduce your policy ideas or revisions to policy with their staff. And I thought that was wonderful. I thought that was great. But for me, it really wasn't moving the needle or driving as much impact as I imagined it would be. I really wanted to see my impact. And so after 5 years working in the private sector, I ended up leading, going to a national nonprofit called Young Invincibles, where I worked for about 3 years as their senior director of external affairs. And so we work to really amplify the voices of 18 to 34-year-olds in the political process. So we worked on things like healthcare, higher education, civic engagement, workforce issues, and that was amazing. We have offices in 5 states, so New York, California, Colorado, Texas, New York, and Chicago, or Illinois. And so we were really able to take those young people in those states, bring them to either state capitals or bring them to DC and tell that story about how policy is in the way of them living their best lives or excelling and living the American dream. And again, you were able to see the immediate impact of your work. And that's what I think really drove me into doing what I do today, which is now leading our global government affairs for a public company, Chegg. We were talking earlier, Chegg is all about being student first and lowering those barriers to access for either materials or learning throughout your journey from high school to college, to finding your first internship, to finding your first job. And I'm able to see that every single day. I mean, Marisa just said she used our product to get really low cost books, right? I think those are the stories that I love to hear.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really impressive how transferable your skills have led you to each career that you've had. I mean, all of those environments that you just disclosed don't seem to be synonymous with one another, but somehow they are.
Yeah, I'll say this, and I know that this is the framework of kind of social work and CRISP, right? A lot of what my mother's a social worker. Let me also just say that. So I get a lot of like my soft skills from her, which I think have differentiated me in the marketplace, in the professional marketplace, having patience, having clear communication skills, being empathetic, understanding what like root cause analysis is when you're looking at policy. How do you actually solve for the thing that's the problem, right? Not like not a tangent from the problem. And so being able to take those core skill sets and apply them in each of those scenarios, I think has really allowed me to excel and kind of do that at a high level.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome. I think it's like really special that like even though it seems completely unrelated, that there's still some transferable skills and just I think also just like acknowledging like as people of color, like, there's not many spaces that have been systemically created for us, or like didn't have a seat at the table. So I think just even navigating the different spaces you take up and like elevating the voices that, are mostly ignored or just not even considered. Because I think even in policy, if we think about it, like it's always like, who is this law or policy written for? Who is it against? Who's included? Who's excluded in this situation? And I think even just the fact of like economic justice and like financial literacy, like, unfortunately politics isn't like a big high paying job, but it's like, oh, maybe there's benefits or maybe you get some clout or something. But it's like, I think also systemically, it's like, how can we like get involved in local politics or even federal or state and say like the law is important, laws on our side, yet like we pay so low wages for people, or kind of like the ethics, moral ethics of that, like can be tainted from, lobbyists who maybe don't have the best interests or basically who has the most money, right? So I just want to acknowledge that tension and also kind of bring it to light where it's like, I think like people like us need to be in these places. And even if you go to private or public, sector, like how can we kind of connect all this through? So like generational trauma or like intergenerational like poverty doesn't get transferred to the future generations.
100%. And I think when I reflect on all the social workers that I know, including my mother, the skill set that they all share is a real high emotional IQ. And I think that often is lacking in the policymaking space. And I think that gets back to what you were saying, Marissa, like who is this policy intended for? Like they understand that piece, but they often neglect to know who it's excluding, right? And it's because like we all on this call have that kind of like that third dimension of what we're looking for, like we can then voice that, right? And so I think that's really important to know and recognize as your strengths as social workers in this policymaking space.
Oh,
I
hi,
have a
Rosalba.
question.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Hi, Rosalba. If you want to get on the chat with us, here, let me add you. And then August, you can lead.
Yeah.
Oh, again.
Hi,
Yeah, another your session.
I just had a question for Jesse. So, have you seen any intersections between policymaking and law? Just because I'm interested in pursuing law school after my MSW this May, I applied to UCLA in the fall. And so I'm really interested in public sector policy and law or international comparative law. And I just want to know like your thoughts, where do you see it happen most prevalent? Or if you don't see it happen, where would you like to see it happen?
So the intersection of social work and law?
Well, yeah, policy practice and law, social work policy and law, just anywhere where you have seen that in your career.
Yeah, I mean, perfect example. I was mentioning that I was in Australia for the last 2 weeks, right? So we brought our legal team. We're all lawyers. By the way, I am not a lawyer. We brought our entire legal team. We brought our CEO. We brought our government relations, me, over. And, it was threefold, right? One, we had to have our legal team interpret a lot of the heads of agreement that the regulator and CHEG were thinking about agreeing to. But we also had to have me in the room to finesse the conversations. Again, understanding the people, the politics, the personalities in the room, while also having the conversation in the background with different political stakeholders, right? And seeing whether or not they would agree to, or what our agreement would be, would satisfy their needs, right? Because what we don't want is for the regulator and CHEG to agree to something in principle, only to get political backlash in the public eye. That wouldn't be good for either party, right? And so I think that's one way that you'll see that overlap between public policy making and the legal realm. I mean, you're seeing it right now play out in real time when it talks about student debt or in student loan, right? You're seeing the Supreme Court right now. Just my old company organization, Young Invincibles, we held a rally on February 28th at the Supreme Court steps talking about student loan forgiveness and what the Supreme Court is actually going to do. So the court is going to interpret Joe Biden's, declaration that he's going to wipe student loans off the table. But that advocacy component that we're all talking about is putting a tremendous amount of public pressure on the Supreme Court to acknowledge that and to uphold that. And so I think that's where, there's that really healthy intersection, right? The law is the law, it's black and white, but advocacy can push that needle into a gray zone, which is healthy, I think.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think you did spot on. Just a fun question, I guess. What kind of challenges did you face, not only in like on the Hill, but also out of the Hill in your professional life, but also like, I think, what boundaries do you think you had to push for more like equitable like outcomes?
Equitable outcomes for who? For my staff, for myself, for the organization?
However you want to answer that, for yourself or for your staff, because I know even sometimes like we're faced with like that moral like dilemma,
Yeah. So I'll say, we could all use COVID as an example. When I was senior director of external affairs at Young Invincibles during COVID. Young Invincibles is a youth-led organization, usually of BIPOC youth. And so it's really important for me, managing over 15 people, to understand that not everybody is coming to the table with the same experiences. And so when we're having daily check-ins, weekly check-ins, monthly check-ins, it doesn't matter what kind of check-in it is, sometimes you're not going to be fully present, particularly with the burden of a pandemic on your shoulders, being isolated, being indoors. And so recognizing that, I fought to have, mental health Mondays, right? Every Monday, we were going to take off at noon, regardless of what time zone you were in, whether you were in East Coast, Central Time, Pacific Time, you were off. And then once a month, we were also going to have full day Fridays off. And so I think that was just like one small element of trying to give back that peace of mind to our employees, who I know, again, this was also on the back of George Floyd and the social unrest that came from that, right? So a lot of our Black and Brown colleagues were feeling the stress of all of that. And I cannot imagine bringing your full self to work every day. It couldn't have happened. And in hindsight, I'm so proud of, my team, my senior leadership team, being able to put that on the table, and for our executive director to be willing to, incorporate that. And I think, it really helped our staff. And now, 2 or 3 years later, we're seeing so many more companies, provide that mental health support, whether it's in the form of taking a specific day off, or even services like Ginger, which is like a mobile app that people can tap into, or, things like that. So.
That's awesome. And I just want to acknowledge Rosalba, if you had any questions. I know you came a little late, but I just wanted to acknowledge like you're here, and that like if you had any specific questions for Jesse, I have questions already lined up. I know August shared some of their questions. So just wanted to.
Two students from Columbia. I love it.
I was going to say, this is like a little Columbia reunion.
Yeah, I'm also alumni. So 3. We had 4. Or where did you go to school, Jesse?
No, I'm George Washington University, an American.
Okay. Nice. Yeah, I remember. Yeah. So Rosalba, did you have anything you want to share?
not really. I'm like fascinated, right? Because I went back to school at 40, so I have been in school for the last 6 years, and I have yet to see people that look like me in the spaces that I am in. Like I have not had one like Hispanic or Latino professor, not one. So it's so lonely, but it's just nice to see.
Do you think, can I ask a question of you
Yeah.
now? I just checked in with our DEI lead this morning. And I asked her that question, like, how do people bring their authentic selves on screen or in these circles when they don't see themselves in these spaces? So I guess I'd put that back on you, going back to school, at 40, like how does that make you feel? And does it give you the motivation to keep going, or does it make you want to change the system and tear it all down and burn it?
A little of both. A little of both. And I had to remember, being in the classes, that there's a lot of people who don't have exposure to people that look like me. And so I hate that I have to be like mindful of that, because I also can know that I can influence their opinion of all my people. And or like being generalized and making assumptions. Like I was in San Diego, Rhode Island, came down to Florida, and they like automatically put me in my internship with like, oh, you're gonna do the Hispanic group. And so all the people I do group counseling, and they don't speak the same Spanish. So like I'm like,
yeah, we're not a monolith, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And I hate when they call me Spanish. But I learned that on the East Coast, they're like, what kind of Spanish are you? I'm like, Spanish rice. It took me
I'm not a language. I'm a person. No, my mother-in-law calls me Spanish. It's like, no, but yeah.
Puerto Rican.
Yeah, but no, I just want to acknowledge that too, because like I think when I was a student at Columbia, like I think like we were talking about like the hood, and I'm just like, I have hood knowledge. I was like low income, but it's like I have this hood knowledge and lived experience where it's like I know like Hermanas like who were undocumented, and during the Trump ICE raids, like I was like, how do you feel about this? And like she was just like, God doesn't care if I'm gonna have papers when I go to heaven. And like that really stuck with me, or like lived experiences of like kids coming over the border with the coyotes, and a lot of immigration work that I did. And like I think going to higher education, or even in like these like white spaces that isn't designed for people of color or low income folks. So it's like I think I said like in one of my classes, I was like, no, like you need my perspective, because you're looking at this from a very educational and clinical point of view, when you need to know like there are personal stories and people I know that is attached to the legislation that you are like opposing. So I think it's like really refreshing to even acknowledge that, because like we have to take up space in order to make space for the future generation of people,
Yeah. No, I 100% agree. And I think when I think about another key skill that social workers have, certainly it's communication, but it's the storytelling that may come with that. I think storytelling moves not just people, but it moves legislation, like you were saying. And for us, and for me specifically, how I approach that, it's really steeped in shared values, right? So shared values plus, identifying bad policy, plus calling out solutions, along with calls to action. Like that's what moves the pendulum towards justice and equity. And so, when I'm asking, how your experience is being in these white spaces that nobody looks like you, like, and what is the outcome that you're seeking, right? That story that you tell us, that you tell yourself, will help move people and legislation in the future, should we want to go down that path. So always remember that. And that's what we've always empowered young people to do, whether it's at our organization now at CHEG or at Young Invincibles, or even when I was lobbying for multi-client companies. We would bring the what is what did my old boss say? We bring the people closest to the pain, closest to the power. So,
wow.
yeah. So if you're closest to the fire, you need to be in the fire to tell your story. Yeah.
So I think my mind shift. I'm a veteran, right? So like, you know, in there, like it is a monolith, you know, like it's everyone looks the same, you know, it doesn't matter. So the big transition and being in medicine, I didn't realize how there were so many stereotypes I had to learn as part of my medical career. So I've had to like, oh, well, when, you know, where somebody could walk into like an emergency room and I'd say like, if I just by looking at them, I made a lot of assumptions, and to have to shift from that over to what I do today. But thank you for sharing that, because I'm like an accidental speaker. I accidentally ended up, I do that as a guest, and I got to do a TED Talk last year. So, you know, it's, I didn't even ever think that those two things would be in the same room.
That's amazing.
Yeah,
That's awesome.
thank
I also
you.
want to welcome Tanashanti. Here, let me add you to the screen. And then August, if you want to come back on, you don't have to. Just want to acknowledge and welcome you. Yeah, so we've just been talking about like racism, issues with structuralism, and things like that, making space for people of color. So Jesse's been really cool. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them or just hang out on here with us. But I do have, I think we're leading to this question that I have. But Jesse, how can new professionals prepare themselves for like these changes, or like moving forward, like trying to make more of an equitable, sustainable systems in place?
Yeah, I mean, it's super tough. I think right now in a hyper partisan, polarized environment, you obviously know who your base of supporters are going to be. And you certainly know who your base of detractors are going to be, and people that are opposing to you. And oftentimes, you know, people always say, don't waste fresh tears on old griefs. Like, you're not going to ever change those people's opinions. But that's not how I approach policy making. Like, there's always intersectionality when you're approaching policy making. Like, lawmakers are not siloed in their thinking. You know, when we talk about you know, higher education and people that can or cannot access higher education, you know, it also comes with a cost with healthcare. It comes with a burden of mental health and wellness. It comes from a burden of geography and location, right? And so, and your zip code and what you were born into. And so these are all kind of intertwined. And if you're able to make an argument to your detractor that resonates, and then follow that through line back to your original point of higher education and the affordability crisis that we're in, as just an example, like, they are more willing to hear you out. And I think people just want to be in the echo chambers that they're in, so that they hear their point over and over and over again. And so sometimes I dip my toes into that world, right? Like, I have to code switch into that world to get my point across. And so I think that's something I certainly tell my colleagues that they need to do. They can't just run from the people who are the loudest against them. They should be running towards them. But that's just also me. I like confrontation and conflict. So I think that's my approach. Secondly, I would just say the speed of technology is just, it's making our world as public advocates so much easier, I think. You know, you're able to put together a front-facing coalition or a front-facing advocacy campaign together in a matter of days rather than weeks or months. Whether it be virtual, like Hopin, or on Zoom, or in person, like I was mentioning about at the stairs of the Supreme Court, you know, you can mobilize a number of grassroots organizations and human beings to mobilize instantaneously. Not only that, but then the speed of information itself will enable you, hopefully in a positive way, to not get misinformation out there, but to really educate either the public or your stakeholders. So I would say leaning into those two tactics are overall a good strategy. I think I answered the question. Sometimes I go on these like tangents and I'm like, well, did I answer that question?
No, you're good. You're good.
Okay.
You want to take over?
Me?
Yeah, like, do you have a question? Sorry, I
Oh,
didn't
I
mean to be the
do. Yeah, I was
facilitator.
coming on mic to ask a question. Yes, I don't know if I want to take over, but yeah, I was coming on mic
Yeah,
to
no,
ask a
yeah,
question. Also,
totally.
hi, Rose Alba. I haven't seen you in a while. It's been a while since we've seen each other. But it was related to the conversation that y'all were having when I popped on, I guess, when you said, Jesse, people who are closer to the pain, closer to the power. I've always wondered, like, the negative sides of that, the negative impacts of that, namely, what is, like, centering a deficit narrative, or like, I come from a child welfare, a foster youth background, I'm a foster youth alum, and how I know many, myself included, and many foster youth alum feel like their stories were being used to, like, raise money, or used to, like, I mean, the crew term is like poverty pimping. That's what
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
finding is what they were talking about, So I'm just wondering, like, and it's a nuanced conversation for me, even how I sit with it, but I'm just, just wanted to throw that in there.
Yeah, no, it's tough to answer that. I know what you're saying. It's almost like a tokenizing the pain in front of your stakeholders. And I'll give an example of somewhere where I felt like that. We at Chegg ran the first ever, it was our inaugural global student mental health week. And so we partnered with 5 nonprofit organizations, one of which was my old organization, Young Invincible. So it's really cool to, have my current with my former. And in that process, we brought 3 students from across the country to Capitol Hill here in DC to tell their personal stories and journeys with mental health and wellness. And, you certainly vet them and you talk with them about if they feel uncomfortable. You don't have to answer any questions. You don't need to share your personal information if you don't feel like it. But I think it really humanizes the issue, particularly around mental health, which I don't think is a partisan issue. It's one of those issues that everyone deals with, no matter your gender, your skin color, your political orientation. But in those moments where they were sharing their personal stories and journeys, I couldn't help but think, am I using them for a political end? Right. But then I had to remind myself, yes, I am, but it's for their benefit, right? It's to advocate for more mental health resources at schools, at public schools, whether it's through K-12 or higher education institutions. And so I think there is certainly a fine line. If you're raising money off of that, I think there's specific language that can be deficit centering that could actually be a negative to your stakeholders and to your campaigns that you're trying to run. So I don't have a clear answer. I could just share with you an example of one where I felt that we were almost blurring that line. But I had to remind myself that the goal was to push and advocate for those resources, and data only gets you so far. Stories are really what change not just people, but policy.
Yeah.
I also think, Jesse, the acknowledgement that you had to step back and ask yourself that question is extremely honest and admirable, because when I worked with the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority back in LA County, I served as a youth representative because my family and I experienced episodic homelessness throughout my upbringing. And so, similar to what you were sharing, was at LASA, there was no accountability or no sense of reflection on how they were using to manipulate our stories to further, support their own interests, specifically tied to the youth homeless demonstration program from HUD, which is like an annual applicant that supplies LA County and other districts with money for youth services. And while they were helping their applications excel, they were asking HUD for about like $20 million for homeless youth services, and we were only getting paid $25 per hour in a stipend. And so, like, you take into account, like, economically speaking, the level of pay versus the level of expertise that we offer, and it's like, I can't help but not agree with what Tanish. I'm not Tanish Sorry, I have the laundry in the back running, but
That's
yeah,
okay.
what
Shati.
Tanishati had expressed is like sometimes when you do bring people closest to the fire, I can't help but wonder if you're burning them more or you're actually providing them with aid. And I think it really just depends on the person with lived experience. And I think it should be up to them to decide because sometimes I think like people find themselves into these leadership positions and they don't have lived experience. And I can't help but wonder if it causes more harm than it causes more resolution.
So what I wanted to bring into the space was like a quote from Toni Morrison that I think about often when I think about this issue. And she says that this function of racism, and I would really extend that to this function of oppression, um, is one of distraction. It keeps you looking for reasons. Keeps you looking for finding proof, as uh, to prove the thing exists, to prove your oppression exists. And I just ask when I think about this, like, at what point do we have enough data? At one point, do we have enough? We know that poverty sucks. We know that poverty, we know it's not great. And we also know that it's expensive to societies. Like, at what point are we just going to take the leap and start investing in the things that we know work and are sustainable and are really regenerative for our society, because it's costing everyone in different ways, but ultimately we're all paying, right, in some ways. So that's kind of what I think about when we think about fundraising. Definitely think about compensation for especially young people, telling their stories and things like that, and that being on par. And just how much lived experience is valued and how, and getting folks being able to monetize is on the tip of my tongue, but I don't really want to use that word, but like being able to actually like leverage, that's better, lived experience to get you into leadership positions because it's valuable experience.
Yeah, I just want to welcome Will to the conversation. Sorry about the interruption, but if you have any questions or anything, feel free to jump in. But I think just like Tanashati, did I say it right? Tanashati, right?
I'm just slow. I was slow. I was muted. Tanashati.
There you go. Just to your point, like I think I've also like wrestled with this question, and I think like in a perfect world, you would have a community that has like a collective need. So it's like sewage issues or like poverty issue, like you would have a need. And if they had a voice of a concern, you would have reason to back that up and like say, this is what we want, this is what we need. And here's the policies we're advocating towards to see it. So I think like in a perfect world, you would have like this collective personal story or issue with like data and research to back it up and advocating in the community. This is what we need. This is the funding. This is what works for us. Because I think that communities have been existing and resisting in their existence in general. So it's like, it's a low income community, but they're still thriving. Maybe they have like neighbors that like help watch the kids for childcare or what have you, or work on the weekends, or, like I feel like there's such a resilience to people who struggle, but also like, I feel like when people have to voice it, it's like, am I willing to accept that I will be tokenized in these spaces and that I will be the spokesperson of my community, even though I don't want to play into that narrative? But it's like, it's also like, like if I'm not voicing my opinion, if I'm not bringing awareness, like who will do that? Who, like, even if we're unprepared for some leadership positions, it's kind of like, if I'm a part of if I'm an insider of this community and I don't see anyone stepping up, like, am I comfortable to take that step and navigate spaces and code switch, just like Jesse said earlier, in these places to leverage and help a greater holistic community, if that makes sense. But I just want to add that in there.
I wonder why we need to code switch. Why can't we hold the line and talk the way we need to talk in spaces and just make people, I mean, again, this is Toni Morrison saying, I didn't move to the center. I stood at the margin and I made people come to me and see that as center. Like, but yeah, the other side of me is also like that, on this point is that Um, sorry, I just lost my train of thought, so I'm gonna mute myself.
Will, I don't know if you had something to say. I saw you unmute. Otherwise, I'm gonna jump in here.
I think I realized I was already unmuted, and then muted, and then unmuted. But I was thinking one thing. No, please finish your thought.
I've been talking a lot. Go ahead.
One of the things that I find strengthens me and is the land I stand on at Columbia University School of Social Work, with an incredible percentage of white women, as the field has itself, right, is peer support. That's my whole focus, leveraging one person connecting with another person, and doing that through mindful contemplation, bringing those two methodologies together. Yeah, Columbia. And I find that by finding my peers of different categories, and ethnic peers being the ones I want to focus my work on and do the research, because Black people aren't even part of the research. Like, that's my first job, to produce what you were just saying, Marissa. And while it's happening, still be on the ground doing the work, collecting information in another way, collecting experiences, collecting my heart energy around the real people that I'm doing the work with and for. And so I'm just going to use those two words like I try to do in most spaces, and just say the power of peer support is vast and undertapped.
Yeah, I love that. Just one thing in terms of like theory of change, the way that I approach it and see it, I mean, we've all been saying it. I'll just say it more directly about how I look at it. It's the data, it's the policy, and then it's the advocacy. And so I think to Tanasha, to your point, and let me refine the people closest to the pain, with the greatest pain, should be closest to the power comment. It is, we center young people and allow them to drive and inform the policy making. So across the country, we have youth advisory boards that we pressure test our policy ideas with their lived experiences and ask them, is this actually hitting the root cause of what your trauma is? That goes through a refinement period of weeks and months. We agree from regions, that bubbles up to the national level. That national level then advocates on that. But that advocacy is only going to go so far, from my experience, without that real lived experience of storytelling that goes behind it. And so that's when our youth will come up behind and be able to tell legislators and lawmakers the real rationale and reason behind the asks in our policy documents. So it's not that we are tokenizing their experiences. We're leveraging their experiences, and we have their voice in the policymaking process from the start. And I think that's what's the big differentiator, I think, from my experience than from the fundraising angle. The fundraising angle is a little bit messy, and I've seen that backfire like a number of times, coming out of the George Floyd social unrest to COVID to even just natural disasters. We were talking about your work, Marissa, in Haiti. Like, I've seen it tokenized so poorly. That's all I got.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I do also want to acknowledge it's 4:50, so we have 10 minutes left. So if any of you have other thoughts, have other questions, feel free to speak up. And it looks like we've been talking about, like your career, and then the advocacy part of this conversation. And I think it's just like, I guess one question I have is like talking about like issues and speaking up. What are some examples, like when your office or when your job would not have changed regardless of constituents' voices? And that being said, like what's like progressive change that you think would not have occurred unless there are people to make space and speak up in those places?
At an organizational level?
Yeah, organization or even political.
I think this, I mean, we talked about student debt, for instance, right? Like the student debt issue really hasn't, we've all dealt with student debt. It's a generational trauma for so many people. And it is intersectional in a number of ways. But I don't think that it's gotten the air coverage or the media attention as it has over the last five years, I'd say. And I really have to, give my hat off to these youth organizers, mostly BIPOC youth organizers across the country who have kind of stepped up and stepped into the light to draw attention to it. I think also during COVID, that was also a real reckoning for students and young people who have shouldered, a tremendous amount of this $1.6 trillion debt. And to see, I'm not going to say anything about Donald Trump, but to see him initiate, a student loan pause, and then for President Biden to continue that pause, and now to have before the Supreme Court, a debt cancellation opportunity before them, like that, I did not think was a realistic outcome in my lifetime, and that's only become real in the last 5 years. And I continue to say that you need to have public forums where there's advocacy being displayed in real time for you to blur the lines of the legal black and white law and push them into a gray zone so that they feel uncomfortable and feel forced to take action that might be against what the letter of the law suggests, because we certainly know what the spirit of the law is, and that's to really cancel this debt.
That's really great. And I think even like further elaboration on like, the law is black and white, but I think this conference always gives me hope that there are students and there are people pushing for the gray and like pushing to change the law that is not equitable to everyone, that was not designed for people like such people of color, BIPOC, or women, or queer, or what have you. And it's just like, I think that should be like the goal, maybe from an abolition point of view. It's like, what would you imagine in like in the world? Like, what do you want to see change in your lifetime, or things like that? And I think for lead organizers, it's kind of like using that imagination and really touching into like, what would a world that I would strive for, that I would want to leave an impression for my generation and future generations. So I guess like I'll throw back the question to Jesse and anyone else who wants to jump in. What's one thing you wish to see change in the world in your lifetime or in future lifetimes?
Oh my God, that's so big. I don't know if I'm ready to answer that question yet. But I will say that I love that imagination approach to policymaking. It's something that we actually used to ask our young people to do. These are students that are either seniors in high school or freshmen in college who are so far removed from the policymaking process. But we asked them, if you had a magic wand, like wave it, what would it look like? I don't know if I'm prepared to answer that question, Marissa. I really don't know. That's a really heavy one.
Well, do you want to jump on mic? I know you said it's unpopular, but it's fine.
Yeah. Even in 15 minutes, I've heard a lot of young people, that phrase, young people, the youth, children. Well, children have parents and grandparents, aunts and uncles. They don't exist on their own. I think it's just really easy to talk about children as if the adults who they depend on don't exist. I see that as a very, very serious problem. And as long as that's happening, the focus on children is never going to be effective. It's just never going to be effective, in my opinion, while we're only focusing on children and young people. So the first thing I heard when I walked in was lived experience. And then young people. So I'm like, they don't have lived experience. What are we talking about right now? So talk to somebody who's 53 about lived experience. And these are my peers, right? When I'm talking about peers, and we're not heard. We're made invisible. And we're America. You know what I mean? It's really odd. When I say we're America, I mean, we've been at this for a while, for a long time. My perspective on politics from black folks going, Ronald Reagan is the Antichrist, and that leading me to enter politics at 11 years old, because I was like, why is everybody saying this Antichrist? And I grew up in the Baptist church. This ain't good. And deciding I was going to start watching C-SPAN, which I have for now 40 years. A youth can't give you that. You'll never get that from them. And so a perspective on what those years of losing all those folks who were amazing in the 70s to crack cocaine and policing, war on Black people, that whole thing, a young person can't give you that. And so it would really be nice if fully adult grown people were heard more and asked questions more, so that we can talk about the generation that came behind me and the generation that's behind them, which no one else can do except the people who are even older than me. So a shift in that perspective would be amazing, because I have to say these words a lot. And one of the classes of people who don't pass the licensing for social work licensing is people over 50. I hear a lot of other groups talked about with that, but people over 50 don't get addressed when we're talking about it. And it's just, there's this whole thing happening that fully grown adult, I say fully grown adult, not like you're not, but we're just cooked a little bit more.
So, thank you.
Yeah.
I think you walked in on an unfair clip in just a
I know. I said, let me not. But
I just want to say that because we were talking about, I think it might have been my comment, and I was talking about foster youth and lived experience. So I was specifically talking about that intersection, something that I have. And I think that, when you live in marginalized, highly traumatic environments, young people do gather a lot more experience than the average population. So I'm going to add up both an and to yours, because I know I'm old soul, because I didn't live some, I didn't see some stuff. So I'm just going to say that yes to your perspective. And also there are definitely young people with lived experience that have wisdom, because I know I'm one of them.
Yeah, I also think just intergenerational wealth is knowledge and powerful. And so it's even mentorship and how much other generations and future generations, but also past generations can tell you hey, this was in the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s. And how can we prevent this thing from not happening in the future? And sharing that common wealth and that common knowledge together, I think is a beautiful, picture at what a community looks like, and what a healthy community looks like is diverse in age and sex and gender and races, in a perfect society. That's how we should function, I think. And I know we're at time now, but I just want to thank you all, because you all are future generations and are gonna be change makers, and hopefully share your LinkedIn's with one another so you stay in contact, but also just there's power in numbers and support and peer mentorship too. So Jesse, I know you're the star of the show and we got it's that time, but did you want to do final remarks for us?
I think this was an amazing conversation. I mean, it really didn't even have to center on me. And I'm glad it really didn't. And we had so many people on the stage to talk about just policymaking generally. And I think, Marissa, you hit the nail on the head. We need all these voices at the table talking about all of our lived experience, young, in the middle, older, for us to really move the needle on the policies that we care about. So I'm grateful for you all jumping in here for the last hour, and let's keep in contact.
Yeah, I'll put my LinkedIn in, but if you could also put your LinkedIn, I know it's like last minute, but it'd be really cool to just stay connected.
Well, I'm gonna see if I can do that. I don't know if I can. I gotta log in and I don't know my password. I'm on my work computer. I'm sorry.
And if not, maybe the main stage, or if you want, Jesse,
Yeah.
you can email one of us, then we could share that out.
That sounds good. Alrighty. Thanks so much.
I
Thank you,
wish I
everyone.
got to experience more with you, Jesse. Maybe in the future.
Okay, well.
All right. Take care. Thanks.
Bye
guys.
to my Columbia squad here.
Hey, I'll see you in
in a
see you in
minute.
an hour, Rosalba.